If you create your own ELT materials and would like to know how you can make them a little bit better, then keep watching. Hi everyone! My name's Atena and I'm an ELT editor and writer. Now this video was actually supposed to be a blog post, but when I started writing it I realized that these things actually sound better if I say them. So here I am. Now this video is for teachers who create their own materials for their students or for other teachers that they share on their websites, fan pages, blogs and so on. It's also for teachers who would like to start writing for publishers because some of these things apply in that situation as well. Now before I move on, let me know if you write your own materials. Please say yes or no in the comments below. Now, I have 5 tips for you, 5 ways that you can improve your materials right now. I actually have more tips than that, but I've chosen these 5 as they're the easiest to implement, and you can basically start using these tips right now. Let's get started. So my number 1 tip is copyright. When you create your own materials, don't use things that belong to others. Unfortunately, I see this very often, and I think it's because a lot of teachers don't realize that what they're doing is actually copyright infringement. Now, I often see people taking stuff off the internet, let's say an article from The Guardian, putting it into their worksheet, creating some exercises, and then distributing it to other people. They give a link to the article that they use, they provide the source, but just because you do that, it doesn't mean that you have permission to use that article. Now this also applies to things like photos, illustrations, song lyrics, songs, films, anything really. Even if things are online and they don't have the copyright symbol or the word copyright, it still means that they're copyrighted. Now there are some things online, for example things that have the Creative Commons license, which you may be able to use as you please. But with Creative Commons you still have to read the licenses because they do come with some restrictions. There are also things that are in the public domain, but again, you would need to see the word public domain written there to be able to use it without any issues. So my rule of thumb is, if you didn't write it, if you didn't create it, then don't use it. Now, why is this important? Well, number 1, it's just the right thing to do. Don't break the law. Number 2, if you become a famous ELT writer and someone starts Googling your name and they find your website and all these materials that don't actually belong to you, then it's not going to look good for you and it's not going to look good for the publisher that you work for. And number 3, when you work for a publisher, you're probably going to have to write about 99% or even 100% in some cases of the material yourself. And texts are probably the most difficult to write. So start writing because the only way you'll improve is by practicing. So you might as well start doing it now. Time for my second tip, which is rubrics. When I first started working for a publisher, on my first day, I kept hearing the word rubrics all the time, and I didn't know what it was. Well, rubrics are basically the instructions for an exercise. And I found that a lot of writers, especially new writers, neglect rubrics, but a rubric can either make or break your exercise. It's very important how you write it. And I have 3 rules when it comes to rubrics. I call them the 3 C's. They are clear, concise, and consistent. So let's start with number 1, clear. I think this speaks for itself. When you write a rubric, it has to be clear what the student has to do and what the teacher has to do. So keep that in mind because a lot of the times when you write materials, you know obviously what has to be done and the rubric might sound clear to you, but does it sound clear to someone else? Does it sound clear to a student whose level might not be that high? Is it really, really obvious what has to be done? So keep that in mind. So my second C is concise. I find that when I work on course books that have a 2-column layout, I don't like the rubrics to go over more than 3 lines. This is because a 4-line rubric or a 5-line rubric looks very bulky and it looks just daunting for students. A lot of the times this means that the exercise has too many stages. So have another look at it and see if maybe you should split the exercise into 2 exercises or maybe even 3 exercises. Also, just have a look at the wording. I find that we often use too many words to say something very simple. So check the rubric and see if you can somehow reduce it, cut some stuff. My third C is consistent, and this is something that I'm obsessed about. Now, you probably all know that we have different ways to say the same thing, and the same applies to rubrics. Let's take, for example, an exercise where you have sentences with a gap and you have to put the word in the gap in the correct form. Now, the rubric can say, put the words in brackets into the correct form, or complete the sentences with the words in brackets in the correct form, or complete the sentences using the words in brackets in the correct form, and so on. Now, the key is that for the same exercise type, you should use the same rubric. And you should do the same when you create your own materials. It just makes it look more consistent and less messy. So how will you remember all of these rubrics? Well, this is where tip number 3 comes into play, and that's style sheet. A style sheet is basically a set of rules that you will apply when writing or editing your material. It basically lists the things that you need to remember, like all the rubrics. It will also list different spelling variations, use of punctuation, capitalization, quotation marks, and so on. Things that you need to keep consistent. So when you create your materials, also create a style sheet and keep it updated and refer to it every time that you need to. Okay, time for tip number 4, which is design. Now, design is tricky to nail because everyone has a different taste and people like different things, but there are certain things worth remembering when you create your own materials. First of all, decide if you're going to keep a 1-column layout or a 2-column layout. Are your columns going to be even or not? Remember that most of these materials teachers are going to have to print out and photocopy, so it's sometimes better to have a 2-column layout because you can fit more than in a 1-column layout. And this is another thing worth remembering. Don't create materials that are too long. If you have a 10-page worksheet, just think, can you somehow shorten it? It's going to cost a lot of money to print a 10-page worksheet for, let's say, 30 students, right? So keep that in mind. Also, when you look at your materials, just think, do they look too busy, too messy? Is there something that you can do to make them look clearer? Is there enough white space? You don't want to have your materials really crammed. White space is sometimes good. You do need some breathing space. Another thing worth remembering, are you going to create black and white materials or color materials? Again, think about the printing and the photocopying. Teachers might not want to print everything in color, so think about that. And if you're working on creating a personal brand, or if you already have a brand, then remember to include your branding in your materials as well. But try and do it in a delicate way so that the branding doesn't take over the content. Okay. Time for number 5, my last tip, which is feedback. So you probably create your materials and you post them on your website or in teachers groups, on your fan page, and you probably hear now and again, great materials, thanks for sharing, that's great. But do you really know what teachers think about your materials? Do you know if they worked in the classroom? Do you know what teachers or students had problems with? Do you know what they would change? Well, this is something worth asking. These days it's very easy to do that because you can use Google Forms or other websites that allow you to create forms and create a quick questionnaire where you can ask these sorts of things. Now, it's important to get feedback because this is the only way that you'll be able to improve your materials and become a better writer in the future. And if you're serious about writing for a publisher, then this will get you used to getting feedback, especially negative feedback, because when you write for a publisher, you'll be getting quite a lot of it. So it's good to train yourself how to respond to that kind of feedback. So these were my 5 tips: copyright, rubrics, style sheet, design and feedback. If you have any questions, then please leave them in the comments, and if you found this video useful, then please like, share and subscribe. Thanks for watching. I'll speak to you soon. Bye!